Hey guys, we are going to pick up at the bottom of page 102. The giver nodded. I wasn't permitted to share the books with my spouse, that is correct. And there are other difficulties too. You remember the rule saying that the new receiver can't talk about his training? Jonas nodded. Of course he remembered. It had turned out by far to be the most frustrating of the rules he was required to obey. When you become the official receiver, when we are finished here, you'll be given a whole new set of rules. Those are the rules that I obey. And it won't surprise you that I'm forbidden to talk about my work to anyone except for the new receiver. That's you, of course. So there will be a whole part of your life which you won't be able to share with your family. It's hard, Jonas. It was hard for me. You do understand, don't you, that this is my life, the memories? Jonas nodded again, but he was puzzled. Didn't life consist of the things you did each day? There wasn't anything else, really. I've seen you taking walks, he said. The giver sighed. I walk, I eat at mealtime, and when I'm called to the committee of elders, I appear before them to give them counsel and advice. Do you advise them often? Jonas is a little frightened at the thought that one day he would be the one to advise the ruling body. But the giver said no, rarely. Only when they're faced with something that they have not experienced before. Then they call upon me to use the memories and advise them. But very seldom happens. Sometimes I wish they'd ask for my wisdom more often. There's so many things I could tell them, things I wish they could change, but they won't. They don't want change. Life here is so orderly, so predictable, so painless. That's what they've chosen. I don't know why we even need a receiver then, if they never call upon him, Jonas commented. They need me, and you, the giver said, but he didn't explain that they were reminded, but didn't explain. They reminded me of that 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? Jonas asked. Oh, I know you tried to train a successor and it failed. Why did that remind them? The giver smiled grimly. When the new receiver failed, the memories that she had received were released. They did not come back to me. They went. He paused and seemed to be struggling with the concept. I don't know exactly. They went to a place where memories once existed before receivers were created. Someplace out there. He gestured vaguely with his arm, and then the people had access to them. Apparently, that's the way it was. Everyone had access to memories. It was chaos, he said. They suffered for a while. Finally, it subsided as the memories were assimilated, but it certainly made them aware of how they need a receiver to contain all that pain and knowledge. But you have to suffer like that all the time, Jonas pointed out. The giver nodded. Yes, and you will. It's my life. It will be yours. Jonas thought about it and what it would be like for him, along with walking and eating. He looked around the walls of books. Reading? That's it? The giver shook his head. Those are simple things that I do. This is my life here. In this room? The giver shook his head. He put his hands to his own face, to his chest. No, here, in my being, where the memories are. My instructors in science and technology have taught us about how the brain works, Jonas told him eagerly. It's full of electrical impulses. It's like a computer. If you simulate one part of the brain with an electrode, he stopped talking. He could see an odd look on the giver's face. They know nothing, the giver said bitterly. Jonas was shocked. Since the first day in the annex room, they had together disregarded the rules about rudeness, and Jonas felt comfortable with that. But this was different. This was far beyond rude. That was a terrible accusation. What if someone had heard? He glanced quickly at the wall speaker, terrified that the committee might be listening, as they could at any time. But as always, during their sessions together, the switch had been turned off. Nothing, Jonas whispered nervously, but my instructors, the giver flicked his hand as if brushing something aside. Oh, your instructors are well trained. They know their scientific facts. Everyone is well trained for their job. It's just that without the memories, it's all meaningless. They give that burden to me and the previous receiver and the one before him. And back and back and back, Jonas said, knowing the phrase that always came. The giver smiled, though his smile was oddly harsh. That's right. And next it's going to be you. A great honor. Yes, sir, they told me that at the ceremony. Very highest honor. Some afternoons the giver sent him away without training. Jonas knew on days when he had arrived to find the giver hunched over, rocking his body slightly back and forth, his face pale that he would be sent away. Go, the giver would tell him tensely. I'm in pain today. Come back tomorrow. On those days, worried and disappointed, Jonas would walk alone beside the river. The paths were empty of people except for the few delivery crews and landscape workers here and there. Small children were all at the child center after school, and the older ones busy with volunteer hours of training. Hours or training. By himself, he tested his own developing memory. He watched the landscape for glimpses of the green that he knew was embedded in the shrubbery. When it came flickering into his consciousness, he focused upon it, keeping it there, darkening it, holding it in his vision as long as possible until his head hurt, and he let it fade away. He stared at the flat, colorless sky, bringing blue from it and remembering sunshine until finally, for an instant, he could feel warmth. He stood at the foot of the bridge that spanned the river, the bridge that citizens were allowed to cross only on official business. Jonas had crossed it on field trips, visiting the outlying communities, as he knew that the land beyond the bridge was much the same, flat and well ordered, with fields for agriculture. The other communities he had seen on visits were essentially the same as his own. The only difference were slightly altered styles of dwellings, slightly different schedules in their schools. He wondered what lay in the far distance, where he had never gone. The land didn't end beyond those nearby communities. Were there hills elsewhere? Were they vast, wind-torn areas, like the place he had seen in the memory, the place where the elephant died? Giver, he asked one afternoon following a day when he had been sent away, what causes you the pain? When the giver was silent, Jonas continued, the chief elder told me at the beginning that the receiver of memory causes terrible pain. And when you described for me that the failure of the last new receiver released painful memories to the community. But I haven't suffered, Giver. Not really, Jonas smiled. I remember the sunburn he gave me on the very first day, but that wasn't so terrible. What is it that makes you suffer so much? If you gave some of it to me, maybe your pain would be less. The giver nodded. Lie down, he said. It's time, I suppose. I can't shield you forever. You'll have to take it all on eventually. Let me think, he went on, when Jonas was on the bed, waiting, a little fearful. All right, the giver said after a moment. I've decided we'll start with something familiar. Let's go again, once to a hill with a sled. He placed his hands on Jonas's back. It was much the same, this memory, though the hill seemed to be a different one, steeper, and the snow was not falling as thickly as it had before. It was colder also, Jonas perceived. He could see, as he sat waiting at the top of the hill, that the snow beneath the sled was not thick and soft as it had been before, but hard and coated with blush ice. The sled moved forward, and Jonas grinned with delight, looking forward to the breathtaking slide down the invigorating air. But the runners this time couldn't slice through the frozen expanse as they had on the other snow-cushioned hill. They skidded sideways, and the sled gathered speed. Jonas pulled at the rope, trying to steer, but the steepness and the speed took control from his hands, and he was no longer enjoying the feeling of freedom, but instead, terrified, was at the mercy of the wild acceleration downward over the hill. Sideways spinning, the sled hit a bump in the hill, and Jonas jarred loose and was thrown violently into the air. He fell with his leg twisted under him and could hear the crack of the bone. His face scraped along the jagged edges of ice. And when he came at last to a stop, he lay shocked and still, feeling nothing at first but fear. And then, the first wave of pain, he gasped. It was as if a hatchet lay lodged in his leg, slicing through each nerve with a hot blade. In his agony, he perceived the word fire, and it felt like flames licking at the torn bone and flesh. He tried to move, but he could not. The pain grew. He screamed. There was no answer. Sobbing, he turned his head and vomited onto the frozen snow. Blood dripped from his face into the vomit. No, he cried. The sound disappeared into the empty landscape, into the wild. Then, suddenly, he was in the annex room again, writhing on the bed, his face wet with tears. Able to move now, he rocked his own body back and forth, breathing deeply to release the remembered pain. He sat and looked at his own leg, where it lay straight on the bed, unbroken. The brutal slice of pain was gone, but the leg ached horribly still, and his face felt raw. May I have a relief of pain, please? He begged. It was always provided in his everyday life for bruises and wounds, for a mashed finger, a stomach ache, a skinned knee from a fall of a bike. There was always a dab of anesthetic ointment or a pill, or in severe instances, an injection that brought complete and instantaneous deliverance. But the giver said no and looked away. Limping, Jonas walked home, pushing his bike that evening. The sunburn pain had been so small in comparison and had not stayed with him. This ache lingered. It was not unendurable as the pain on the hill had been. Jonas tried to be brave. He remembered that the chief elder had said he was brave. Is something wrong, Jonas? His father asked at the evening meal. You're so quiet tonight. Aren't you feeling well? Would you like some medicine? But Jonas remembered the rules. No medication for anything related to his training, and no discussion of his training. At the time for sharing of feelings, he simply said that he felt tired and that his school lessons had been unusually demanding that day. He went to his sleeping room early, and from behind closed doors he could hear his parents and sister laughing as they gave Gabriel his evening bath. They have never known pain, he thought. The realization made him feel desperately alone, and he rubbed his throbbing leg. He eventually slept. Again and again he dreamed of the anguish and the isolation in the forsaken hill. The daily training continued, and now it was always included pain. The agony of the fractured leg began to seem more and more mild, as a mild discomfort, as the giver led Jonas firmly, little by little, into the deep and terrible suffering of the past. Each time in his kindness, the giver ended the afternoon with color-filled memory of pleasure, a brisk sail on a blue-green lake, a meadow dotted with yellow wildflowers, an orange sunset behind the mountains. It was not enough to alleviate the pain that Jonas was beginning to know. Why? Jonas asked him after he had received a torturous memory in which he had been neglected and unfed. The hunger had caused excruciating spasms in his empty, distended stomach. He lay on the bed aching. Why do you and I have to hold these memories? It gives us wisdom, the giver replied. Without the wisdom, I could not fulfill my function of advising the committee of elders when they call upon me. But what wisdom do you get from hunger? Jonas groaned. His stomach still hurt, though the memory had ended. Some years ago, the giver told him, before your birth, a lot of citizens petitioned the committee of elders. They wanted to increase the rate of births. They wanted each birth mother to be assigned 4 births instead of 3, so that the population would increase and there would be more laborers available. Jonas nodded, listening. That makes sense. The giver was certain. The idea was that certain family units could accommodate an additional child. Jonas nodded again. Mine could, he pointed out. We have Gabriel this year, and it's fun having a 3rd child. The committee of elders sought my advice, the giver said. It made sense to them, too, but it was a new idea, and they came to me for wisdom. And you used the memories? The giver said yes, and the strongest memory that came back was hunger. It came from many generations back, centuries back. The population had gotten so big that hunger was everywhere, excruciating hunger and starvation. It was followed by warfare. Warfare was a concept Jonas did not know, but hunger was familiar to him now. Unconsciously, he rubbed his own abdomen, recalling the pain of his unfulfilled needs. So you described that to them? They don't want to hear about pain. They just seek the advice. I simply advise them against increasing the population. But you said that was before my birth. They hardly ever come to you for advice. Only when what was it you said? When they have a problem that they've never faced before? When did it happen last? Do you remember the day when the plane flew over the community? Yes, I was scared. So were they. They prepared to shoot it down, but they sought my advice. I told them to wait. How did you know? How did you know that the pilot was lost? I didn't. I used my wisdom from my memories. I knew that there had been times in the past, terrible times, when people had destroyed others in haste, in fear, and it had brought them their own destruction. Jonas realized something. That means, he said slowly, that you have memories of destruction, and you have to give them to me too, because I have to get the wisdom. Then the giver nodded. But it will hurt, Jonas said. It wasn't a question. It will hurt terribly, the giver agreed. Why can't everyone have the memories? I think it would be seen a little easier if the memories were shared. You and I wouldn't have to bear so much by ourselves if everyone took part. The giver sighed. You're right, he said. We're actually going to stop there on the very top of page 113 because it's already been 15 minutes. Thank you for tuning in. I will talk to you tomorrow.